Beer, chips, and shitty country music. That would be my diet for the next few days. I'd finally wrangled some free time to spend with my best friend and blood brother, Chris. After high school, we fell in different directions. It's amazing the different pace of life going to college causes. Chris studied hard, and with one plaque and a crippling amount of debt later, found himself working as an attorney back in his hometown. Recently, he had his first child with his wife Lydia, a lovely woman, although I never get to see her and Chris nearly as much as I want. I went down a different path. I was married at 19 to my former prom queen. We had an extra mouth to feed since 21, and it's been an uphill battle from then on. Now my son has left for college himself, just like his godfather. Not to say I'm not busy, but life has taken an easier turn. Chris and I barely spoke during COVID, but now we've managed to chisel a weekend out of our calendars to catch up. I decided to go camping. After combing through countless cheapo booking sites and possibly getting a virus off one of them, we both thought, fuck it. Tent ready, we set off into the great unknown, planning on pitching up wherever we felt like it, just as we had done in the summer of 1999. Chris showed up at my house in his battered gray family wagon last Friday evening. We packed a broken cooler box and more equipment than we knew what to do with. We were already reminiscing about our youth as we pulled out of my driveway. Remember that time Vlad stole Mr. Hastings' car? Right after he failed him in English, Chris asked as we crossed the county line. I chuckled a reply. God, yeah, I do. Vlad was insane though. He was always doing shit like that. Hey, can you remember what his real name is? Chris continued. Eugene? I think so, anyway. Even his own mother called him Vlad. You know what he's doing now? I said as I looked at Chris, who was squinting at the road ahead. Don't drink and drive, kids. Prison, Chris replied, and we both burst into another bout of overcompensatory laughter. Once we were silent again, Chris looked at me and said I'm serious, and we both started roaring again. Felt like a school kid around Chris. A few years ago, the last time we met up properly, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder on numerous occasions, half expecting a real adult to come take away my beer and replace it with a lecture. I had that same feeling again now, and I'm glad I did. 3 hours later, the road turned to a dirt trail, and then to a road again, albeit a much less maintained one. As we were being buffered around by the potholes, Chris spoke. We're definitely coming up to the place I found. Keep an eye out for any signs, he said as he pounded the GPS, trying to get it to work. Damn thing's having a seizure. Chris had found a serene stretch of woodland whose owner, the widow of an old timber tycoon, allowed and encouraged wild camping. Not long after the GPS failed on us, we came to a fork in the road. There was one sign that pointed to the path left and read Naxbridge. Ring a bell? I asked Chris. Sort of, he replied, and after a while of mentally mulling it over, yeah, that must be it. With that, our battered rambler took off down the left road, and further into the forest. Eventually, the tree cover began to pitter out as it gave way to the infrastructure of what we assumed to be the sleepy town of Naxbridge. Thankfully for our navigation, there was only one main road that cut through the village. I stared at the passers-by, busying themselves with market stands and vendors. A new mother pushed an old pram. A pensioner sat on a freshly painted bench and fed the birds. Youths kicked around a ball on the grassy knoll. We passed through the heart of the town and drove past the rows of vividly colored houses, all facing out to the road. Some people were out in their front yards, potting flowers or just relaxing. We quickly passed through the village, leaving it in our wake as we drove on. Seems like a nice place, said Chris, looking around for any indications of a camping ground. We should have stopped and asked someone back in Naxbridge, I told him. Just as we were debating on whether to turn around, a small gas station came into view just up ahead. I'll pull in here and ask someone, Chris said, taking the words right out of my mouth. He turned the car into the station, which was nestled neatly into the tree line. Want anything while I'm at it? He asked me as he was getting out. I think we have enough junk for the weekend. Oh, wait a second here. I grabbed a tissue and a pen. Get them to draw a map for us. Chris took it from me with an eye roll and marched off into the station. While I was waiting for him, I flicked on the radio. Nothing but static. Signal after signal, all it picked up was a harsh white noise. I was about to turn it off when I heard something through the hum. I turned up the volume and listened closely. I could hear a faint, undulating pulse. It was soft and routine and was barely audible within the static, but it was there. I jumped back, startled by the door swinging open. I didn't realize how close I'd moved to the radio. Chris climbed back into the car with a sigh. Before I could ask the obvious, he told me. Apparently, there is no camping site around here. Not only that, but it turns out that we're, and I quote, not welcome round these parts. With that, Chris threw the napkin turned map onto my lap. I held it up to the light and studied it. They also drew us polite directions on how to fuck off, Chris said earnestly. Who's they? I finally asked him.
Some old guy and his wife, he replied. They seem really brought into that mom and pop shop horse shit. Was there anyone else in the store? A few, Chris clarified, maybe 3 or 4. Why? Well, did you ask any of them for directions? Or just the obviously sour old couple? I asked. Chris knew what I was implying and sighed. He wordlessly opened the car door and got out, making his back into the gas station. While he was gone, I popped open the glove compartment and rummaged around for a Tom Waits CD. I was dragged away from my search by the radio turning itself on. I looked at the knob, brow furrowed, trying to figure out if I'd accidentally hit it somehow. The same pulsating beat began to pour from the car's speakers. I quickly switched it off again, feeling the beginnings of a migraine. Before long, Chris trudges out of the store, shaking his head and sighing so dramatically it sounded like a drowning man's dying breath. He climbed back into the car and slammed the door shut. Bastards, he muttered to himself as he started the car and pulled out of the station and onto the open road. Any luck? I asked rhetorically. They all had the same reply for me, Chris began, told me I should leave small towns to themselves, whatever that means. This young one did tell me about a campsite not all that far from here, but it didn't sound like the place. What should we do? Chris glanced at me. Whatever you want. An hour later, we were struggling with a tent. One of the collapsible pipes had snapped and was being held together with duct tape. That duct tape meant it was now too thick to pass through the canvas passage along the top of the tent, which was supposed to give it its shape. Eventually, we collapsed into our camping chairs, defeated, and cracked open a few cans. Chris and I had driven for a while longer after our unfriendly interaction at the gas station until we came across a dirt road swerving into the forest. We decided to follow it and eventually came across a perfect little clearing on the banks of a too-good-to-be-true lake. We knew a certain danger came with pitching a tent in the open wilderness, but that's what we came here for. Besides, we weren't all that far from the main road. Chris convinced me to move the tent a little further inland, pointing to the sodden earth creeping in a few yards from the water's edge. We found a nice spot around a minute's walk from the car, and that's where we chose to begin our struggle. The sun was near setting by the time it was up. Once it was, and most of our things had been unpacked, we set about starting a fire. Half a can of kerosene later, the fire was roaring, and we both settled into our camping chairs for the night. This still beats our last attempt at camping, joked Chris as he took a sip of warm beer. That it does, I said, sinking into my chair. That it does. Recreating a scene from Jaws, Chris swung his leg up over the arm of my chair, pulling up his trouser leg. He showed me the burn mark along his calf muscle. What about your memento from that night? He asked me. I smiled and shimmied my arm out of the coat sleeve. There was a deep puncture scar just above my bicep. Unlike Chris, I hadn't been near the camping stove when it exploded. I was, however, near enough that a piece of burning metal, the makeshift shrapnel of a butane canister, got lodged in my arm. We weren't the only ones on that trip. A few buddies of ours and their girlfriends at the time had accompanied us. We were the only ones dumb enough to try and cook a steak on a tiny stove in complete darkness at 3 in the morning. That last trip didn't exactly go to plan, but this one had gone off without a hitch. The little hiccups we experienced just add more flavor to the story we can tell our kids. It was a long night of talking, drinking, and really reconnecting. Chris bestowed me with his surprise, 2 Cuban cigars he'd kept hidden from me until now. We smoked them and acted as if we were in a cheap gangster film. Our plan was to stay up until dawn, but our middle-aged bodies gave out on us, and we crawled into our sleeping bags shortly after 2. In the hour or so of sleep I got that night, I dreamed of the forest. Not surprising considering where we were, but that wasn't what made it stick out in my mind. It was the pull. I felt myself falling towards the trees, gliding across the woodland floor as if it was vertical. I kept falling until the forest disappeared and was replaced with darkness. Darkness and a hum. I was awoken by Chris shaking my shoulders. Matt, wake the fuck up, man, Chris said, whispering the first half and shouting the second. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag. Chris, I said, rubbing my eyes. What is it? It's everyone, Chris replied, his voice shaking. Slowly, I crawled out from behind him, and we both peeked from the tent. Chris's plastic torch shone over crowds of people, dozens, maybe even hundreds, among the trees. Startled, I grabbed Chris's collar and yanked him back into the tent. What the fuck, is all I could say. Chris sat directly in front of me and itched his nose. I got up for a piss and saw them, he said, standing there still as statues. They didn't do anything? They didn't move an inch. They aren't even looking at us. I found a drop of courage and moved past Chris. I pulled down the zip all the way and stepped out of the tent. Sure enough, the rows and rows of people surrounding us were all looking, uniformly, out to the east of our position, deeper into the woods. Before I could do anything else, I realized that I recognized one of the people. A mother, holding her newborn in her arms. I saw her earlier on that day, when we were passing through Naxbridge. Recognize any of them? Chris asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. Yeah, I replied, that young mother. I saw her back in Naxbridge. Chris nodded. I saw this old man, realized he was the same guy as I saw at the gas station, Chris said, pointing into the crowd. I turned to him. What the hell should we do now? I asked. To the car, Chris replied, grabbing his bag from the tent, having quickly packed the essentials. He made me do the same. Once I had, he gave his torch an extra wind-up, and we began our walk to the car. The people we walked past looked barely awake. They all stood in a perfect rowing, disappearing into the darkness of the forest on either side. Their mouths slack, their eyes blank. I began to wonder if we'd stumbled into a town-wide trip. Thankfully, my worst fear of one of the catatonics suddenly reaching out and grabbing me didn't come true. Chris and I finally shrugged our way past the figures into the car. He took the keys from his pocket and unlocked it, swinging his bag into the back and taking his place in the driver's seat. He didn't bother looking back at the formation of people who all seemed to be sticking to the tree lane. I sat next to him and slammed the door behind me. We exchanged cautionary glances as he put the key in the ignition and turned. The car sprung to life, and so did the radio. The shrill noise it emitted was noxious. My hands went to my head as I bent double over the dashboard. From the corner of my eye, I saw Chris being affected in the same way. It was excruciating. It felt like there was a rabid ferret in my skull, trying to claw its way out. Almost debilitated from the pain, I felt around for the knob on the radio, desperate to switch it off. Me and Chris found it at the same time, and as the radio ceased, so did our agony. Reeling, we both slumped back into our seats. Chris managed to compose himself enough to sit up and turn to me. Just as he was about to speak, his eyes widened, terrified, and he grabbed the steering wheel. Oh shit, he muttered to himself frantically, trying to get the car going. Confused, I turned and looked out of the passenger side window. What I saw stuck with me. The masses of people standing perfectly still had turned around and were now staring directly at us. I watched them as the exhaust sputtered out black vapor and the old motor forced itself into motion. When we moved, so did they. The front row was petrified, but countless people began running at us from behind them, furious and sprinting full pelt. As we drove, they flung themselves at the car, fearless and intent on stopping us. The sedan bounced and buffered its way down the dirt trail, climbing over roots and the bodies of those who jumped in front of our wheels. It was hell. I covered my eyes, shielding my sanity from the mass suicide taking place all around me. Finally, one of the townsfolk managed to get onto the car, running straight at us and jumping onto the hood. The pensioner held on for dear life, and once he had a good enough hold on us, started to repeatedly slam his forehead against the windshield. Blood and small cracks spread through the glass. Chris swerved erratically, attempting to throw the old man off. The noise of our screams was replaced with the deafening sound of a tire exploding. Chris was thrown from the wheel as the car spun out of control, tumbling from the dirt path down the slope and deeper into the forest. I held my head in my arms and braced from impact. The old man on the hood was splayed open, bits of him dripping from the branches. Steam bellowed from under the mangled metal. Dazed, I unbuckled my seatbelt, pushed open the car door, and let myself fall to the ground. I vomited and slowly stood up from my hands and knees. On uneasy legs, I walked around the wreck to find Chris in the same position on the ground, nursing what looked like a broken hand. Wordlessly, I helped him to his feet. He formed a weak smile, and we swung our arms around each other, keeping ourselves balanced. Before we could form a plan, we heard the familiar, rapid crunching of undergrowth. We turned to see dozens of Knacksbridge residents sprinting over the brow of the hill, some falling over as they tumbled towards us. As best we could, we ran, impeded by our own bodies, who were ready to give up. We limped on further into the forest. It was Chris who noticed the faint glow up ahead. We were no longer steadying each other, now just trying to outpace the pursuers behind us. Every time I glanced back, they advanced, until I could feel their cold breath on my neck as we ran. My will to survive dragged me violently forward, same with Chris. Desperate and bleeding, we cleared another ridge and fell, tumbling down into a clearing. We helped each other stand, resigned to the fight that would surely ensue when they caught up with us, and saw it. Sprouting from the dead center of the small clearing was a brain. A human brain, almost the size of our car. A soft light emitted from the pinkish-gray tissue. Tiny particles danced in the air around us like electric sugar. I felt a dull rattle take over my body as my mind was flooded with a comforting brown noise. It made my sinuses clear and my earwax loosen. After a while of just standing there, staring at the infinite wrinkles of the woodland brain, I realized that we were surrounded. The population of Knacksbridge stood around us, expanding out in an incrementing spiral. All of them stood like me, open-mouthed and blank-eyed before the brain. The brain of God. The brain was my God now. It was everything to me. I felt like I'd found my life's purpose. Anything other than blind devotion seemed ridiculous. Within my liver, I felt true meaning begin to manifest for my soul. It was all because of the brain, and then Chris stamped on it. His foot mushed through the gray matter, lodging itself in the gunk. A torrent of white, creamy liquid poured from the gape. The glow ceased as the particles screamed and died and fell to the earthy floor. Chris grabbed me by the collar and shook me until my pupils stopped dilating, until I felt thought again. "Chris?" I asked, feeling like I'd just woken up. He smiled and grabbed my forearm, leading me away from that monolith of madness. Around us, countless people lay on the ground, gripped by violent seizures. Foam welled from the edges of their mouth as blood dripped from their eyes and ears. Churs and I stepped over them while we walked back to the car. It was a scene that will never leave me, a scene that is tattooed on my subconscious. I see it every night again when I dream. It must have been 1,000 people. You couldn't make out the forest ferny floor, with every inch covered by a dying human. They thrashed violently as we made our way past them, trying not to look down. Every so often, light from the full moon overhead who spit down through the boreal canopy and highlight a particular death face of anguish. Finally, we found the car. The victims had begun to thin out by now, with only a dozen or so filling our field of vision. I helped Chris push his car from the old oak tree, which was still covered in the blood of that unfortunate old man. Chris told me that other than the torn coolant hose, the damage was just cosmetic. It was safe enough to drive, maybe not all the way home, but certainly far enough to get us back onto the highway. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but I didn't care. I slumped back into my passenger side seat and slammed the door shut behind me. Chris did the same, and after an unbearable amount of rotations in the ignition, the key finally made the ruined car were to life. I closed my eyes as we started to move. When Chris woke me up, we were surrounded again, this time by flashing lights of blue and red. Cop cars. They had pulled us over driving an unroadworthy vehicle. I never thought I'd be happy to get threatened with 6 months in prison. An hour later, we were waiting in the lobby of the local police station, talking to officers who were confusedly scribbling down notes. In the early hours of that morning, my wife arrived. By midday, we were back at home. I've sat on this story for a few months, not sure of who to tell or where to tell. I've been seeing Chris a lot more frequently since then, and we now truly feel like we're back to normal in some strange way. Although my wife must be sick of hearing it by now, I still haven't told the story to my son, or anyone else I know for that matter. I've been quietly trying to find out more about Naxbridge, and have come across nothing. It's as if any mention of the town has been whipped from the internet. You're welcome to try and find out more for yourself. And please, if you are able to come across something about that village, for the love of God, tell me. I know the monolith, the brain, isn't dead. Not really. I can still hear that background hum, because it never originated from one place. It's coming from inside my own mind, and it's never going to stop. I've been camping in the woods for 2 weeks, long enough for the world outside to feel distant, unreal. My food supply is running low, but I don't mind. Out here, the quiet is intoxicating. I spend most of my time wandering through the woods, probably straying further from my tent than is actually advised. I can't help it. I want to forget society exists. And sometimes I find cool stuff. Yesterday, I found a horse. At least I thought it was a horse at first. It stood in the clearing, framed by skeletal pines, its coat impossibly white. The air around it shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt. Its mane was long, silken, and a twisted horn jutted from its forehead, reflecting the dull light of an overcast sky. That's when I realized, holy shit, that's a unicorn. My first thought, insane, childish, felt like a dream breaking through reality. There was no way it could be anything else. It looked just like every depiction of the white equines I've ever seen. It was magnetic to look at, drew me in, made me want to talk out there and see just how soft that fur was. Thankfully, I saw the carcass before leaving the tent. A bear, ripped open from throat to belly, its insides spilled onto the pine needles. Steam still rose from the glistening ropes of intestine. The smell, thick, coppery raw, curdled my stomach. The unicorn dipped its head, muzzle dark with blood, and bit deep into the bear's ruined chest. It tore away a chunk of meat, the wet sound of it nearly sending me to my knees. I should have run. I should have backed away slowly, silently. But I stood frozen, breath stuck in my throat. I had never seen anything so grotesque. The picture of innocence, devouring the flesh of something it had to have killed itself. As I watched, the unicorn shoved its muzzle into the soft, blood-wet folds of flesh. There was an awful squelching sound as it rooted around. When it straightened back up, thick strands of rapidly cooling blood dripped from velveteen lips and onto the needle-thick floor below. Its ears flicked once, twice, and then it turned toward me. Its eyes weren't a horse's eyes. They weren't even an animal's. They were black, deep, endless voids, too large, too knowing. Strings of flesh clung to its teeth, and when it chewed, I could hear the wetness of the sound. I stumbled backward, my boots snapping a branch. The creature's ears flicked, and it took a step toward me, hooves pressing into the wet earth, leaving behind something darker than mud. The scent of decay rolled off it in waves, suffocating, like an open grave. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face, roots clawed at my ankles, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard it move, slow at first, then faster. A steady, measured trot, the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the trees. I don't know how I made it back to camp. I don't remember how I got inside my tent, hands shaking so violently I nearly ripped the zipper. I spent the night curled in my sleeping bag, buck knife clutched to my chest, heart hammering against my ribs. There was a moment around midnight where I swear I could hear hooves moving again, but nothing trampled my tent. This morning I forced myself outside. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind. The trees loomed too close, their bark split and weeping something dark. It only took a second look to realize that something thin and sharp had been scraping into the trunks, leaving behind deep gauges. My stomach twisted into tight knots. The forest no longer felt like a safe haven or a way to escape the crash of reality. Especially not when I stepped further into the morning light and saw the hoof prints circling my tent. I left. It didn't matter how much I had loved the quiet or how badly I had wanted to escape society. None of it mattered anymore. Something was out there with me. That creature had circled my tent in the night, and I wasn't about to wait around and see what happened next. My hands shook as I tore down camp, stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack and rolling up my tent with frantic, clumsy fingers. I left behind anything that slowed me down: food, cookware, even my extra clothes. I slung my pack over my shoulders and took off down the trail, moving fast, too fast, my boots slipping against damp leaves. I didn't look back. Not until I heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow at first, then faster. I spun around, heart hammering, and caught a flash of movement between the trees. White shifting between the skeletal pines. My body moved before my mind caught up. I grabbed the knife from my belt and threw. The blade spun, glinting dully in the weak morning light. Then it sank deep into something soft. The sound that followed was not human. A shrill, keening wail tore through the woods, sharp enough to send ice racing through my veins. My breath caught as I took an involuntary step forward, stomach twisting. It was small, smaller than the one I had seen yesterday. Its coat was white but dull, streaked with dirt and dried blood. Its huge, black, endless eyes locked onto mine, and something in them made my chest constrict. The knife was buried in its throat. Blood welled up, dark and slow, spilling over its chest in thick, sluggish rivers. Its legs trembled, buckled. Then it collapsed. I didn't stay to watch it die. I ran. I fucking ran. The hoofbeats didn't follow, but I felt something behind me, something massive and furious, pressing against my back like the weight of a coming storm. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My hands shook so badly, I nearly veered off the dirt road. Now, I'm sitting in my car at a gas station, typing this out, trying to calm my breathing. I think I saw a unicorn in the woods. I think I killed its child. So, what do you think the chances are that this ends badly for me? A heavenly scent means death. I was gifted with the ability to smell deaths. And it wasn't a terrifying smell like rotten flesh. No. Not at all. It was exactly the opposite. The smell of death, in my case, was like heaven. It started when I was in elementary school. One day, my grandma was visiting, and at first, I didn't notice anything unusual about her. We were in the middle of a conversation when suddenly, a scent filled the air, a scent so beautiful that I felt like I was standing in the middle of a garden, surrounded by blooming flowers. "What scent is that, Grandma?" "Is that your perfume?" I asked her innocently. "What scent, sweetheart?" "I'm not wearing any perfume," she replied, looking confused. Exactly the next day, she died of a heart attack. Grandma had been suffering from heart issues for years, and considering her age at the time, it wasn't a shock. I didn't realize it to be my gifted ability at first, not until several deaths later. Mom was always the one I talked to every time I smelled the heavenly scent radiating from people near me. She didn't know what it was at first either. But after several deaths and countless conversations, my mom and I came to the conclusion that I had the gift of being able to smell deaths. It's a gift sent from above for a reason. You don't brag about it. My mom reminded me, time and time again. She also reminded me not to tell anyone else, especially not those who radiated the heavenly scent. They might be able to avoid it if I told them. I argued. "Nikki," she said with a calm and wise demeanor. "That may be true, but in most cases, death is inevitable. No one could do anything about it. It scares people to know they'll die in the next few hours. Death itself is already something people are terrified of, even without knowing it's coming." I agreed, so I kept the ability between me and Mom. Not even my dad or my older brother knew about it. For years and years of my life, every time I smelled that heavenly scent, the kind that made me feel like I was at the heart of a sunlit garden, I knew death was coming. A heavenly scent meant death, but it was usually just one person at a time. Well, except for that one moment when I encountered an entire group of people who emitted the heavenly scent all at once. They might die at the same time, from the same cause, Nikki, Mom explained when I asked her about it. They were standing in the queue next to us at the amusement park. Things like that happen under various circumstances. A few hours later, I read in the news that they had been in an accident on their way back from the amusement park. My gifted ability bothered me at first, but eventually I got used to it. The smell was gorgeous, calming, and soothing. You get used to it too. One day, I was at the mall with 3 of my friends. We were browsing through the running shoes at a store, and nothing seemed or smelled unusual. It was just a regular day. Then, within seconds, it bloomed. The heavenly scent radiated from every single person in the store, all at once. Having had this ability almost my entire life, I could tell the difference between the scent coming from one person, a small group, or an entire room. But still, I walked around the store, discreetly sniffing everyone, my friends, the staff, even the strangers browsing nearby. "What is it, Nikki? Is something wrong?" Talia asked after I returned to them from walking around the store. My face must have looked like hell when I came back, considering Talia's concern. "Nothing," I replied, trying to reassure them. But I couldn't just shrug it off. They all had it. They were all emitting the heavenly scent. All at the same time. How the hell did that happen? On our way back to the parking lot, we passed by dozens of people. Every single one of them emitted the heavenly scent. I was horrified. Nothing like this had ever happened before. When I got home, I was about to tell my mom about it. She was the only person who knew about my ability. But I stopped the moment the heavenly scent radiated from her too. "You okay, Nikki?" Mom asked, noticing that I was on to something. "Yeah, Mom, I'm okay." I walked around the house, my heart pounding. As I got closer to my dad and older brother, the scent filled the air around them too. Why the hell was everyone emitting the same heavenly scent at the same time? That could only mean one thing. They were all going to die at once, most likely from the same cause. But all those people? There were so many of them spread across different places, at the mall, on the road, at home. Most of them didn't even know each other. What could possibly kill them all at once? I turned to the TV my dad was watching, and an emergency news broadcast was on. An asteroid had just fallen past the Earth's atmosphere, heading directly toward the town we lived in. The asteroid is expected to hit the town in no more than 2 hours, the news anchor announced urgently, looking extremely horrified. "We encourage everyone in town to evacuate as soon as you hear this news." The town I lived in wasn't small, and it was home to quite a number of people. With the panic and chaos caused by the sudden, terrifying news, I was certain that not everyone would be able to evacuate in 2 hours. Then I realized I had forgotten something. I lifted my hands, bringing them close to my nostrils, and I sniffed myself. I too smelled like a garden full of blooming flowers.